been made possible through the generous support of Petro-Canada. Our energy is Canada. By the Economic Development Authority of Leduc, Canada's Black Gold Centre. And with assistance from Imperial Oil of Canada Limited. The year was 1946. Canada was beginning to move away from a war economy that had lasted for 6 long years. The population of Alberta was hovering at about 900,000, and as now, the two major business centers, Edmonton and Calgary, were competing for first place, each with about 100,000 citizens. Alberta's Turner Valley, the country's most productive oil field, was now on the decline after years of steady, if not spectacular, production. This raised questions in the minds of the major oil companies about Western Canada's potential as anything more than a natural gas producer. Just 2 short years later, however, these worries would be put to rest in spectacular fashion, as the attention of the entire world focused on a quarter section in the new Leduc field, at a well known as Atlantic No. 3. Alberta's powerful energy industry came of age in a pillar of fire.
Is there a well there producing 15,000 barrels of oil a day?
Yes.
Or is the stock of the company publicly trading?
Yes.
For what you trading at?
25
25 cents or $25?
cents.
Buy as much as you can.
Last night, the wild oil well in the Leduc field, 20 miles south of Edmonton, caught fire.
Atlantic No. 3 really put Alberta on the map as an oil-producing province.
I've seen several blowouts, but nothing as bad as that one was.
The story of the blowout at Atlantic No. 3 begins with the vast promise of the Leduc field near Edmonton, Alberta, and a renegade entrepreneur who saw the potential for untold wealth. His name was Frank McMahon.
The millions of people who saw the opening and closing ceremonies of the '88 Winter Olympic Games, which originated from this venue, probably had no idea as to the colorful background of the man whose name still graces this venerable stadium. The wealth he was to amass during his lifetime was due largely to the catastrophe that took place at Atlantic No. 3. A native of Moyi, British Columbia, Frank McMahon began his career drilling in the Fraser Delta.
After several unsuccessful ventures in BC, Frank set his sights on the riches of Alberta's Turner Valley field. If there was one thing Frank had learned by this time, it was the importance of using other people's money. Hence, the public company West Turner Oils was created and listed on the Vancouver Exchange. But soon after, he was asked to resign from West Turner because of his extravagant spending practices. In 1939, West Turner became Pacific Petroleums and enjoyed moderate success. In his period of exile from Pacific, McMahon indulged in many new ventures. One of them was the Atlantic Oil Company. Frank McMahon's business dealings had always been questionable, and the way he secured the lease that eventually yielded No. 3 was no exception. First, we must understand the important location of the parcel of land. It was February 13th, 1947, when Imperial discovered oil at its Leduc No. 1 well. The oil patch knew it was onto something big and thus began an unprecedented drilling boom. The land around Leduc No. 1 was hot property.
They were mostly immigrant landowners, Ukrainian descent and German descent, and some English-speaking English people. They were good farmers and very proud people, good dealers, and those that had the mineral rights were most anxious to see the development.
This is the land Frank McMahon set his sights on in 1947 as it looks today, seemingly untouched by the great oil well fire of '48. It belonged to the Rebus family, who gained title when Bronislaw Rebus homesteaded there on his arrival from Poland. His death in 1940, however, created a title dispute in the family, and McMahon used this to make his play. Imperial Oil had already signed a lease agreement for the land on October 22, 1946, for the princely sum of $5 and a 12.5% royalty, or about 3 cents an acre. Someone, somewhere, tipped off Frank McMahon about the conflicting rebus claims and the clouded imperial lease. Enter Norman Bus Lacey, Frank's confidant and chauffeur. Well-known and well-liked, it said he could charm the birds out of the trees. On July 2, 1947, Bus Lacey signed an option with John Rebus, the son with the strongest claim on the land, for $175,000, plus 25,000 shares of Pacific Petroleum's, or the equivalent of $1,250 an acre. To keep him away from the competition and other family members, Bus Lacey took John Rebus to the Calgary Stampede and kept him entertained and occupied. John Rebus was a rich man.
It was the kind of risk that oil men were not uncomfortable with. You might go out and acquire 50 leases, and you know you're bound to have a problem on some of those leases. And this was part of the game at the time, and I don't think anybody in Imperial felt badly towards somebody for being astute enough to pick out a defect in the lease, and we had that happen to us on a number of occasions.
To this day, no one knows exactly where Frank McMahon came up with the huge amount of cash he paid for the Rebus land. To appease Imperial Oil, McMahon signed an agreement which was to provide them with 100,000 barrels of the well's production. Normally, this would have been paid off over about 4 years, but when No. 3 went wild, the payout only took a few days. In the early years of Alberta's energy industry, wells were drilled using steam-powered wooden rigs like this one that stands today in Calgary's Heritage Park. By the time Frank McMahon was ready to exploit his newly acquired parcel of land, steam had largely been replaced by diesel power. The rig Atlantic Oil was to secure for the drilling of No. 3, however, was an older steam-powered model owned by General Petroleum's. Although the people at General Petroleum's were not thrilled about the prospect of working with McMahon, they wanted his money. They were just steps ahead of their creditors due to some bad luck they had encountered while drilling in Cat Creek, Montana. And Frank's parcel of land was, as they say in the oil business, a lead pipe cinch. The man in charge of the rig that drilled Atlantic No. 3 was Cody Spencer. Born in Oklahoma, he was tough, demanding, and had a mania for speed. Exactly the kind of man McMahon needed in his run for the money. Tom Wark was working on the well when it went wild.
Atlantic No. 3 blew out because we didn't have enough surface casing. After 7 attempts of cementing, they decided to go ahead and drill it in dry, which means you pump water down, but there's no returns coming back up the well. They drilled about 35 feet this way, and finally the bottom opened up and all the mud went down the hole, at which time the gas entered. Then every gas zone that was open started to blow.
In those days, the Conservation Board had no blowout prevention requirements. Atlantic No. 3 was fitted with a Hosmer button, which was supposed to do the job. It didn't. Lyle Caspell, an Atlantic hand, called the Hosmer button a monster piece of equipment and suggested its inventor should be drowned in the mud. On March 8, 1948, the inevitable happened.
When Atlantic blew out, I was in the cementing department. We saw it when it blew. Of course, I had seen other wells blow previously, and what we saw was a stream of black liquid floating or shooting upwards over the crown of the derrick.
The initial blowout fired a master bushing too large for 2 men to carry out of the wellhead like a ping pong ball. The fact General Petroleum's had to use an old steam rig was providential. With a power rig, there is little doubt the spewing oil and gas would have caught fire immediately at a considerable loss of life and property. But fate had stepped in, and Frank McMahon now had a well producing 15,000 barrels a day through a 40-acre choke. The blowout quickly became a tourist attraction. Ignoring the potential danger, curious locals flocked to the well for a glimpse of the spectacle.
And these people hadn't the foggiest notion of what a wild well could do. I remember turning a lady back on the road who was carrying in a baby in arms, and I turned her around. I said, "You don't want to go in there."
Access to the well area was restricted to those with special passes, and the massive job of controlling the runaway began. Those who sought to tame the wild well were faced with a bubbling, seething lake of oil and gas.
I remember very well that the production from this wild Atlantic well had the effect of backing off production from 50 or so wells in the Leduc field.
A pipeline had been laid to the railhead at Nisku a year earlier, and it was able to handle much of the extra production from No. 3. It was originally slated to run directly through a church cemetery, but the closely knit farmers of the area would have nothing of this.
I met, first of all, the priest in his black coat and black hat, and behind him there were a large number of area farmers, and they were equipped with shovels, picks, axes, pitchforks, and they were weapons to be used to make sure that nobody came on that graveyard. And although I tried very hard in order to talk to them and tell them why we wanted to go through here and why we couldn't bend, they refused. And finally, Imperial Pipe had to go around the graveyard. And I had some sympathy with these landowners.
The dirty job of controlling No. 3 continued. Renowned wild well fighter Myron Kinley was brought in, but he was shocked when he found no fire.
He was a firefighter. When he came up there, he was quite disappointed we weren't on fire. He went out and looked at it, but he said he would stay there and help us until he was needed somewhere else.
Although Kinley was to miss the fire, he was to find and hire a man who would eventually become the most famous wild well fighter of them all, Red Adair.
Red Adair come up with the truck with the fishing tools to fish them out of the hole, and he worked with us at the rig when we froze the wellhead, took the Hosmer button off and put on a new high drill, and he worked with Myron Kinley through this operation. Myron liked him and hired him to work for Myron Kinley in firefighting.
To restore lost circulation, a dizzying variety of items were pumped down the well. Redwood fiber, chicken feathers, sawdust, even ping pong balls. As well, 10,000 sacks of cement were pumped down in one shot. This came to be known in the folklore of the oil industry as the big cement job, or the 10,000 sack job. A small army of about 75 men had to be mobilized. They manhandled the 87.5-pound bags of cement to 7 cutting tables, where they were split open and dumped into hoppers. The slurry was then pumped down the well, but with little effect. The hard work at this point began to get to some of the men. One of them told Cody Spencer as he stormed off the site, "I'd rather go to jail than pump cement down that SOB."
Zonalite is in this insulation for houses. We pumped truckloads of Zonalite down. It didn't help any. We got 1.5 tons of chicken feathers from a poultry place in Edmonton, and we pumped them down. They didn't do any good. We brought in cottonseed hulls from the States, truckloads of them, pumped them down, and they didn't do any good.
It's said for years afterwards, drillers in the area were to find chicken feathers, ping pong balls, and cottonseed hulls in their wells, the legacy of Atlantic No. 3. It was at this time that the only serious injury occurred during the blowout. It happened to a man by the name of Cliff Covey, and the blame can be pinned on human error.
We had a toilet there built out of metal, about 4 feet square, and built out of corrugated tin metal. He went in the toilet, and he sat down on the seat and took out his cigarette and match and struck it. It blew that toilet. There wasn't a piece of tin within 100 feet of me. He was just sitting there on the seat, and it burned his behind, and it burned his back of his neck pretty good. Oh, we called him Shithouse Covey from then on.
During the blowout, Frank McMahon was recovering oil at a furious rate, from 10 to 15,000 barrels a day. But other production in the field was at a standstill.
I'm standing in the Energium, in the Energy Resources Conservation Board building in Calgary. It's largely conceded that the blowout at Atlantic No. 3 marked a coming of age for the board, because in 1948, when all efforts by Frank McMahon and Atlantic Oil failed to control the runaway well, the board stepped in, and for the first time, flexed its muscles.
The board had hoped the big cement job would succeed in plugging up the bore. That project having failed, they had agreed to the hiring of Myron Kinley, but even he himself admitted, no fire, no use for dynamite. The next straw was the doomed feather job. As the days and weeks dragged by, the ERCB was under increasing pressure to act, and act they did. In effect, they placed the well in the capable hands of Imperial Oil, and ERCB Chairman Ian McKinnon specified a man named Tip Maroney for the job.
I have had and have a very high regard for Tip. He was an exceptional person, in my opinion. Not only was he knowledgeable, but he inspired confidence in everybody.
Vincent John Tip Maroney's career had spanned 20 years and 2 continents. Joining him on the project were Charlie the Dutchman Visser, a drilling expert whose expertise would be crucial in the days ahead, and Canada's pioneer mudman, Jim Todd. Their plan was to drill 2 relief wells using directional drilling techniques, which would intersect at the base of No. 3. Because of the extreme fire hazard in the area, diesel rigs could not be used. But General Petroleum's, the drillers of the out-of-control well, fortunately had 2 more of the outdated steam rigs and called them in from the States. They were given a lucrative contract to drill the relief wells, another windfall from Atlantic No. 3. The drilling of the 2 relief wells was almost complete when the ground around the wellhead began to buckle and the derrick collapsed. The date was Monday, September 6, 1948. The time was 6:18 p.m.
I was having dinner in my apartment in Edmonton, and the dining room faced to the southwest. It's probably about 25 miles from the well site, and I just happened to be looking off in the distance, and I saw this well catch fire. And there was no question in the world what it was.
I was just on my way back from Turner Valley. I was just getting near Leduc when we saw the ball of fire go up in the air. I figured my crew and my rig could be gone. So I just let my wife and children out in Leduc, and I was out, and by this time it was cordoned off. But I got around them and walked across the fields, and crew were all just happy as could be, sitting on the edge of the derrick floor watching the fire.
I heard them holler that the fire had started, and it was just a small ball right over the wellhead, and gradually grew bigger. Charlie Smith and Hickman Kearns were running out the boardwalk out to the road there trying to take pictures over the shoulder with the movie cameras. And when I heard them, I went and got my camera and climbed up on the rig and started taking pictures there.
To this day, the exact cause of the fire is unknown. However it was caused, there was no doubt about the stir the spectacular blaze created. At the McDonald Hotel in Edmonton, the top brass of the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation were assembled in celebration as they were preparing to broadcast from the hotel. One keen-eyed executive saw the smoke and flames rising from the south and sent reporter Ralph Horley off to get the story. In a small, single-engine aircraft, using a primitive wire recording device, he made this historic recording.
It's the worst oil fire I've ever seen. This brings back memories of the bombing of Berlin. We'll have to wait until it burns out on top and then try to control it from below. Well, those are some of the statements we heard from the men who stood helplessly by as Atlantic No. 3 roared and belched huge hanging clouds of black smoke.
We're flying at 3,800 feet in the vicinity of Atlantic Well No. 3 in the Leduc oil field. We can see the injection wells that they are using, that they have dug to the base of Atlantic No. 3 to inject hot water, acid, and everything else they can think of, everything known to the science of oil. to try and stop the flow of uncontrolled oil from Atlantic well number 3.
After plowing a fire guard to protect the neighboring property, the rig hands at number 3 took a well-deserved break, because now, at last, they could smoke. Pictures of the fire were splashed across newspapers and on newsreels throughout the world.
I was in either Abilene, Texas, or Midland, Texas. And this was in September of '48. And I went to a picture show after dinner, and the newsreel carried the pictures of Atlantic on fire. My God, I wonder how these pictures got down into the United States.
Ironically, the 2 relief wells that were drilled to control the blowout were ready when a well went up in flames. On the second day of the fire, massive amounts of water from the North Saskatchewan River were injected down the west relief well. The most spectacular blaze in Alberta's history died an unspectacular death. The well itself was not controlled until several months later, thanks to an ingenious solution provided by Tip Maroney and Charlie Visser. After several failed attempts to plug the well with calcium and cement, they developed what they called bazookas. Forced down the well, they would expand under pressure, acting like giant stoppers. These strange-looking devices, which the hands dubbed Maroney's suppositories, finally put an end to the blowout at Atlantic number 3. That's the story of the great Leduc oil well fire of 1948, or at least as much of it as we could pack into a half hour. The blowout at Atlantic number 3 left behind a legacy for the province of Alberta. More than just placing the province on the map as a major player in the oil game, the events surrounding the blowout established standards and procedures the industry has abided by to this day. As well, it established the Energy Resources Conservation Board as a power to be reckoned with. Most of all, however, Atlantic number 3 captured the essence of an era long past, when wildcatters roamed the province looking for the big strike. Untold wealth was just one well away. It is a moment frozen in time, one that will live forever as a part of Alberta's history.
It brought a tremendous amount of publicity and excitement to the area. The newspapers were full of it.
I think it had a terrific impact on the industry. It made McMahon a millionaire, and it put Leduc on the map. It was worthwhile. And thankfully, there was no injuries in the whole deal. No serious injuries.
I can remember standing there, and it was very quiet where I was standing. And gas was coming up all over, and it sounded like the rustle of leaves in the fall.
As I drove along, I was looking at the fence posts alongside of the property, and I watched these fence posts, and they were sitting in the holes and bubbling and popping up and down like this, you know.
Production of Blowout at Atlantic number 3 has been made possible through the generous support of Petro-Canada. Our energy is Canada. By the Economic Development Authority of Leduc-Nisku.